Well, of course, January 6th didn't come out of a vacuum, and it didn't vanish without a trace. My next guest, the former Republican Senator and Defense Secretary William Cohen, was warning of an impending disaster before the storming of the Capitol. And he joins me now from Washington, D.C. Secretary, sometimes, you want to, give yourself a pat on the back for being prescient, and sometimes you wish you weren't right. And I would imagine it's the latter for you, reliving what happened 1 year ago today and where we are as a country today, 1 year later.
Well, it's disheartening because I spent a quarter of a century on Capitol Hill, and every day that I drove into my office and looked up at the Capitol, I felt the spinal shiver, saying, "What a great country it is to live free and with liberty for all of the people." That has been something of a myth for many people in our country because we haven't all been free. And you'll go back to the founding of the Constitution and the writing of the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, all the way through 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, et cetera, to show that we haven't lived up to our declared ideals. But nonetheless, I felt a thrill going into work. I worshiped my colleagues that I served with. And I went through a period of shock, anger, deep resentment over the defilement of the U.S. Capitol. To see the people who were storming the Capitol, it reminded me of the image of John Lewis being beaten when he was trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The same people who were attacking the Capitol were attacking John Lewis. And it brings me to the contradiction, at least, and the hypocrisy and duplicity of members of Congress who will honor the casket of John Lewis lying in state, Bob Dole lying in state, John McCain lying in state, and then engage in the kind of hypocrisy where they're prepared to deprive people of the right to vote, who are doing everything in their power to perpetuate a fraudulent lie upon the American people. So last year was a hellish moment for the United States, but I don't see that we have progressed very much. You can say we've increased $1 billion for the budget for the police, but no amount of police is going to save our Constitution if it's not in the hearts and the minds of the American people. So that's where we have to concentrate. What is it the Republican Party stands for today? Does it stand for truth? One professor said we're living in a post-truth era. Well, post-truth means pre-fascist. And I think we're closer to a pre-fascist era than we are to a truthful one that we had been living in the past.
Well, and just to go down that road, a lot of what we heard from President Biden today, and what I would argue is one of his most powerful speeches yet, was just the fact-checking of not only what it means to be in a democracy, which means you love your country regardless of whether you win or lose. We're not fair-weather citizens in the United States. And he fact-checked and dispelled every single lie that was told by former President Trump and his supporters. That having been said, he did hit on something that I wonder if it speaks to what you're talking about now, and that is that no other Republican member of Congress or politician raised their own elections, right? They were on the same ballots that day. They were down ballot tickets, and yet all of the fraud and misgivings that they say happened only at the top of the ticket, which just would never make sense. So is it less about dispelling a lie or more about people believing what they want to believe regardless of the facts?
I think too many millions of American people are drinking from lead-lined sewer pipes. That disinformation, misinformation, lies are being fed through that lead-lined pipe and is actually poisoning their brains because they believe anything that the President of the United States, former president, says and does without regard to the facts. And so it's discouraging to think that we have the benefit of having access to more information than at any time in the history of this planet. And yet we have just as much disinformation, the bottom of the sewer bubbling up into mainstream media that enters and alters the brain powers of too many of the American people. If you don't believe in truth, and what do you believe in? You believe in lies. And so what's become, the Republican Party has become the liars club. And the membership is simply tell a lie or believe a lie. And the dues you pay is contribute to the aggrandizement of that power in the name of Donald Trump and his family members. And so I think the Republican Party that I belong to no longer exists. It consisted of people like Bob Dole and Jack Danforth and Warren Rudman and Al Simpson and Dan Coates and so many others who believed in the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power. That no longer is the case for the majority of the Republicans who serve. And by the way, they serve with the title of the honorable. And I don't consider them to be honorable if they continue to buy into the lie that this last election was stolen. Where is the proof? Show me the money, as the movie used to say. Show me the evidence that this was somehow stolen. And they can't, and they haven't. It's been rejected by every court that's considered. So
right.
I think it's just the liars club. And that's a shame for our country.
There is no proof because, frankly, and President Biden reiterated this today, 2020 was the most secure, safest election that this country has had. I want to bring up this article that the three retired generals co-authored. And this was just a couple of weeks ago, in which they say that they are, quote, chilled to our bones at the thought of a coup succeeding next time. And they talk about the fact that 1 out of 10 of those who stormed the Capitol that had been charged had some sort of military background. And it worried them about what that means about not only where the country is today, but obviously going forward in terms of who's in charge and who gives the orders ultimately. I want to read from the piece. The potential for a total breakdown of the chain of command along partisan lines from the top of the chain to squad level is significant should another insurrection occur. The idea of rogue units organizing among themselves to support the rightful commander-in-chief cannot be dismissed. Imagine competing commanders-in-chief, a newly re-elected Biden giving orders versus Trump or another Trumpian figure issuing orders as the head of a shadow government. It's frightening to think of that, and one looks at countries, unstable countries around the world going through a scenario like that. Unfathomable to think that it could happen in the United States, and here you have laid out by three former generals who are worried about just that.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the singular features of our government has been the subordination of the military to civilian rule. The problem also is at the top. If you have a civilian commander who doesn't believe in the rule of law, who believes in the law of rule, and then gives directives to people that he appoints who will bend to his will or to his perversion of the rule of law. We came close. Former President Trump tried to put in place, he had 4 secretaries of defense in 4 years. He tried to put in place those who would subvert the rule of law and simply abide by whatever command he gave them. That was the reason why there were every living Secretary of Defense before the January 6th assault upon our Capitol wrote a letter saying we need to be forewarned that there's talk about having an invocation of the Insurrection Act to impose martial law in order to overturn this election. There's a real fear that someone like Trump, who doesn't give a hoot about the rule of law, could once again assume power and not have to face the electorate ever again and put in place people who would carry out whatever order he gave, illegal or not, suspension of human rights, civil rights, habeas corpus, whatever he wanted to do. So I think that we're at a point now where the American people have to recognize the fragility of our democracy, that this sends a signal not only to all of us who live in this great country, but to all of our enemies, adversaries, competitors, that the United States is divided from within, and we've sown doubt to those who are about. And so I think it's at a dangerous point for us. We're still a very strong military country, for sure, in terms of our military power. But the rule of law is under assault, and it's under assault from without, and it's also under assault from within. And so we have to dedicate ourselves to fighting back, to challenge those who shout louder than anybody else, who use incivility, demagoguery, and the threat of abuse, of physical assault, in order to override the voice of reason. So we've got a fight on our hands, and the question is, are the American people prepared for that fight? It's going to be a long haul of the next 3 years.
Yeah, you mentioned how our, I would say, allies and foes abroad had been watching what transpired a year ago. And, you know, from what we heard from even the Chinese officials, that they were frightened by this instability. The world's leading nuclear power is in the process of something that no one had seen in centuries take place at its capital. President Biden touched on this very issue and what message it sends to our allies, but most importantly, our adversaries. I want to play a clip from this.
From China, Russia and beyond, they're betting that democracy's days are numbered. They've actually told me democracy is too slow, too bogged down by division to succeed in today's rapidly changing, complicated world. And they're betting. They're betting America will become more like them and less like us. They're betting that America is a place for the autocrat, the dictator, the strongman. I do not believe that. That is not who we are. That is not who we have ever been.
And Secretary, you can't say that was hyperbole. I mean, did you ever think that there would come a day where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of the United States would have to call his counterpart in China to tell him to not worry about what's happening in the U.S. right now, that the country is stable and that democracy at times is, quote, messy?
The one thing that superpowers understand is the need for continuity, predictability, consistency. When there's chaos, instability, they worry. They're not sure what we might do in a moment of anxiety or misinformation or some rumor that is spread like wildfire through the internet that causes them to take preemptive action because they think we are doing something preemptively. That's a very dangerous for all of us, for the Chinese, for the Russians, for any country in the world, because we have so much destructive power at the end of our fingers. So it was absolutely right for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs to place a call saying, do not be misled by what you're hearing or even what you're seeing. We are still together as a country. We are not planning to attack you. And he's been criticized for saying that. In other words, would you forewarn a nation you're going to attack them? Well, in this world in which we live, in terms of nuclear power, cyber power, it seems to me that call was more important than ever when you have the scene of mobs of Americans storming the citadel of democracy, sending a signal that we are breaking down into anarchy and anything was possible. I think that was a dangerous moment, and thank goodness the chairman of the Joint Chiefs placed a call. That's the whole purpose for having a hotline.
Yeah,
I recommended that back in 1997.
I by no means am criticizing. I by no means am criticizing him for making that call. I guess the point I was making was, did you ever think that that call would come from the United States of America to China, as opposed to vice versa? I want to end on something you mentioned earlier about the Republican Party that you knew no longer being here. We are a country that needs to have, that cannot survive as a democracy with just one functioning party. What will it take to bring the Republican Party back, the one that you knew?
It's going to take a great effort at every level of our society to say, let's come back to a sense of decency, civility. We thrive on debate and disagreement. That's what democracies do. But we've always had a sense that we have respect for someone else's opinion. Today, that sense of respect is almost non-existent. So what we have to do is say, the debasement of language is a precursor to a debasement of values. And when you debase values, then you can no longer hold up the lamp of liberty and saying, we are the leader of the free world. The free world is looking to the United States and what we represent to them, freedom. Freedom means not just being able to say whatever you want to say or do what you want to do, but it means saying and doing things that also contribute to the well-being of the larger community at the local level, state level, and at the national level. A willingness to understand that you are acting, your actions also affect your neighbor, and you must act with due respect for his and her safety as well as your own freedom. That's the message we have to get back to our own, because what's happening is we are disintegrating from within when we lose respect for the rule of law and simply say that liberty is for those who are able to use power and brutality and rule by the savage few.
Secretary Cohen, thank you so much, as always, for your words today and your insight. We do have a sense now, if we haven't had over the past year, of just how fragile our democracy really is. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Amanpour Company is made possible by the Anderson Family Fund, Sue and Edgar Wackenheim III, Candace King Weir, the Cheryl and Philip Milstein family, the Strauss Family Foundation, Jim Atwood and Leslie Williams, Mark J. Bleschner, Bernard and Denise Schwartz, Koo and Patricia Ewan, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Additional support provided by these funders and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in London. This week, democracy in focus. Certainly it's the top of President Biden's agenda, and tonight it's the top of ours too. How do we build democracy, and how do we preserve it when it's under threat? In the years since the storming of the US Capitol, hundreds of rioters have been charged and arrested, but none of the ringleaders. This week, Attorney General Merrick Garland said that he would go after all the perpetrators.
The Justice Department remains committed to holding all January 6 perpetrators at any level accountable under law, whether they were present that day or were otherwise criminally responsible for the assault on our democracy.
So accountability is a vital tool, and all week we've been exploring this issue. First up tonight, our conversation with the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's made it her life's work to examine American democracy going all the way back to President Lincoln and the Civil War. Also joining us is Yale University's Timothy Snyder. He's been warning for years about the threat of creeping authoritarianism, not just around the world, but also in the United States. And I spoke to both of them on the eve of the January 6th anniversary. Doris Kearns Goodwin and Timothy Snyder, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us. What I want to ask both of you first is, in light of this one-year anniversary since January 6th, the polls are very troubling in the United States. More than 71% of American Republicans continue to believe that Biden's victory was so-called illegitimate, and 81% of Americans believe there is a serious threat to our democracy. Doris, from the historical point of view all the way back to the Civil War, which you have written so much about, are you surprised that 1 year later we do not seem to be out of the woods?
I am surprised. You know, I thought a line had been drawn after January 6th, that finally there had been an understanding of the need for a change in the country and to get back to our democratic ideals. It seemed hopeful when Senator McConnell talked about the fact that President Trump was responsible morally and practically for the attack that had happened, and that it was an undemocratic attack, and that he hadn't done what he needed to do once he knew what was happening to stop it. And when Kevin McCarthy said it was an undemocratic attempt and some sort of responsibility had to be accrued, it seemed to me that the Republican Party was accepting some sort of separation from President Trump, much as after the attack on Charles Sumner. I had seen it as an analogy to what happened in the 1850s when Charles Sumner was attacked by a pro-slavery congressman, Charles Sumner being an anti-slavery senator, in the Senate itself, bludgeoned with a cane into unconsciousness, his spine and brain injuries so great that he couldn't even come back for 3 years. and it changed the whole party structure. The Whig Party collapsed. The new Republican Party was formed. Anti-slavery got a great strength as a result of it. And I thought that's what was happening after January 6th. But now to see a year later, that the idea that the election was stolen is still agreed upon by 81% of the Republican Party, that the people who said that this was an undemocratic thing have changed their mind and gone down to see President Trump, it really worries me, as nothing has done in my lifetime, about whether we can have a peaceful transition of power. It's the most important thing in a democratic country. You accept a loss. Every other president accepted a loss, and you move on. If we don't accept this kind of election in January 6th of 2021, will we not accept it in 2024, 2028? I mean, there's a real scare, I think, that's in our system right now. This has to be fought.
So let me ask you, Timothy Snyder, what Doris just said and what observers are saying, that this January 6th event may have just been a dress rehearsal, may have been the indicator of things to come.
I think at the moment, unfortunately, that is the default. I think that is now the most likely thing to happen. I think if we're going to address the future as a democratic country, what we have to realize is that that's not some extreme or dystopian scenario which is being thought up by somebody in some back room. That is what is actually unfolding in front of us. And I think if we have a problem in this country, it's that we have a very hard time remembering the recent past. So we have a hard time remembering that this almost happened a year ago. There was, in fact, a plot to overturn a democratic election for president in the United States. It just happened. And if we have another problem in this country, it's that we believe that we're exceptional, we're a city on a hill, these things might happen elsewhere, but they can't happen here. And it's that very faith in our own exceptionality which prevents us from preparing for what is frankly quite obvious. I mean, the things which make this very likely, some of them have already been suggested by Doris. Number one, all of this is ensconced in a big lie. As early as the summer of 2020, Mr. Trump was already saying that he wouldn't concede office if he lost, that if he lost, it could only be fraudulent. So this big lie that if Republicans lose or if Trump personally loses, there must be fraud, that surrounds everything. There's a penumbra of that around everything. That's the justification for the new state laws. That's a filter for who can be who in the Republican Party. That creates a huge media safe space on the right side of American media. And then the other thing which is strange about our system is that we don't have a national electoral authority, like, say, Canada. We have the states, and the states are basically able to compete or race to the bottom to find ways to subvert the election the next time around. So honestly, it's not a question of whether it can happen. It is happening. The question is, what do we do about it in the meantime?
Okay, so that's what I want to ask you both. Let me just turn to Doris from the perspective of history and what you are seeing now as you witness this happening in your lifetime. I want to ask you both, Doris first, how does one roll back this threat?
I think we have to go back to history just for another moment to be able to see what we need to do today. Because one of the things that Abraham Lincoln warned about when the Civil War was just beginning was that the central idea of democracy was the idea that you could have regular people choosing their electors and choosing their government. And that what the South had done by not accepting the fact that the Republicans had won the election in the North and broken away from the Union and secession as a result showed that democracy can't work. And I think what we have to do, it's the most important legislation that has to be passed right now. Voting rights is absolutely essential to this right now. The bills that are there to be done, the filibuster will have to be changed to make them come to the floor. They're going to protect the right to vote that's being undone right now. It's time for a political revolution at the top of our country, and those bills are addressing that. And it seems to me that that's the most important issue that should be on our minds right now. Democracy is at peril. It's been at peril at other times in our place, but we were able to do something about it. When Franklin Roosevelt was taking office, somebody said to him, if your program works, you will be the greatest president in the country. If it fails, you will be the worst president in the country. He said, no, if it fails, I will be the last president in the country. So there's a real sense that when we've had crises in our countries before, it was an economic crisis in 1933, that it looked like democracy could not prevail. But Franklin Roosevelt came in, he was able to establish faith in the government. People were saying we've got a leader again, and that fear that some sort of coup might take place was undone. We are now in a similar situation, and actions, the most important thing we have to do is to get voting rights. The most important fight in my lifetime that I've seen in a long lifetime now.
And as you say, without protecting the right to vote, you might as well kiss democracy goodbye. I mean, it's obviously the fundamental is a fair and free vote. So, Timothy Snyder, you heard Doris speaking from the perspective of a long history on a revolution needed at the top of our country, is what she said. You've got an all-democratic presidency, Congress, and the like happening right now, and the president can't even get his infrastructure bill, not because of the Republicans, but because of his own party. How do you see a revolution happening, if you agree, or protecting, American democracy? How is that possible?
Well, I guess in fairness to Mr. Biden, we should probably remember that President Roosevelt had tremendous majorities. So just to keep the comparison fair, if Mr. Biden had a bigger majority in the Senate, we wouldn't be talking about the things we're talking about, because voting right legislation, and I agree with that's the absolutely essential thing, would already have been passed. Let's hope that it can be, but in the meantime, there are a few other things. Number one, I think we have to start now with the resuscitation of local news in the United States. That may seem peripheral, but it's actually central. One of the reasons why people don't trust electoral outcomes is that there's no longer local news. There's nobody who's reporting this kind of story in the U.S. anymore. A second thing that I think we have to be willing to do is to talk, as Doris has already mentioned, about a right to vote as a fundamental right. In the United States, we don't actually have that. There is no recognition by the Supreme Court or in general that Americans have a right to elect their president. I think those are rights that we need to be insisting upon as a people. The third thing, though, and this is not so much for Democrats or for citizens in general, this is now for Republicans, who we haven't talked about very much. I think Republicans need to be having a conversation amongst themselves about what happens if they seize power in 2025. Mm-hmm. Because, the logic is, let's scheme, let's subvert, let's find a way to take power even after Mr. Trump, let's say it's Mr. Trump, loses by, let's say, 10 million votes, which he probably would. I think it's very possible that they could do that legally. And in doing it legally, they would be following examples of other authoritarian countries, like, for example, Hungary. But I think what they're not thinking about is the next question. You can seize power that way, but you can't seize power in the United States. Because at that point, the United States ceases to exist. There's no way that a population which has just elected someone else is going to stand by and watch this happen. There's no way that police forces and armed forces, for that matter, are going to be united about this kind of attempt to install a president. So you can go for this kind of scenario, but if you do, you wreck the country, you wreck our military presence abroad, you wreck the American dollar, you wreck all of those things. And so I think the discussion that Republicans should be having is that really what we want to do?
I was just going to add one point of hope, which is that I think the Select Committee on January 6th, as it comes out with more information about what actually happened between the time of President Trump's failure to win the election and what happened in January 6th, if that becomes a story that then can get really put across to the country as a whole, I still think there's a potential for the country, if it sees it from beginning to middle to end, what really happened, to absorb it and begin to change their minds, as I thought they would after January 6th.
But Tim, the so-called big lie you've written has a very ugly pedigree. It's decades old, and probably before that, even centuries old. Go back and tell us where the big lie started, how it started, and what it means.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, the reason why I began to use that term back in November of 2020 is that I could see how this was all going to roll out. I could see that what Mr. Trump was doing in speaking about the election was telling a lie that was so big that it could create a kind of alternative reality, which has in fact happened. And if there was a time when it could have been stopped, as Doris hoped, it was in November and December of 2020. Once that wasn't clearly stopped then, it was very likely that we would end up where we are now. Americans are just as vulnerable to this story about how they are the real victims as, let's say, Germans were back in the 1920s and 1930s. This is how, going back to your very, very first question, how coups work. A failed attempt at a coup is always practice for a successful attempt at a coup. It's in that meantime, in that period between the first and the second, that the other side, the people who care about institutions, have to learn lessons.
Can I ask you both a final question? Because we're going to be looking at what happened in South Africa back in 1990 when apartheid fell. Nelson Mandela came out representing the majority who had been horrendously oppressed by the minority of whites, and yet had his own commission, the Truth and Reconciliation, that Desmond Tutu then was the head of. What kind of example does that provide us?
Well, you know, I think there's an analogy with Abraham Lincoln, because there was a whole discussion after Appomattox and the war being won for the Union. What do we do with the rebel leaders? What do we do with the Confederates? And what he said was, I don't want them hung. I don't want them brought to justice in that way. What I really hope is they'll just leave the country. Let them go. If they stay here, they will have to be punished, but we have to look forward. So I think in some ways he provides an example for what happened at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that need to understand that we have to move forward and begin to create a new society. And that's what he hoped to create. And had he lived, I think Reconstruction might have been even a far more powerful change of a new society. And unfortunately, that's what the South lost, the best friend they could have had, as well as the North, in not having that leader there to take us through that period of time.
Doris Kearns, Goodwin, Timothy Snyder, thanks so much for joining us.